From July 5th to 7th, nearly 2,000 Russian flights were delayed, almost 500 canceled, and 3 major airports were brought to a standstill. Russia blamed Ukraine's drone attacks for the collapse, and in plain sight, it looks like the perfect reason. But beneath this excuse lies the dark truth behind Russia's silent skies. Some experts claim in just 3 weeks, Russia's aviation industry lost nearly 30 years of progress. Its factories are stalling, planes are grounded, parts are vanishing. If nothing changes, experts warn, by 2030, Russia could lose up to 40% of its entire fleet. More than 300 aircraft gone. Mind you, they don't mean Ukraine destroying these planes, because Ukraine could just watch them getting destroyed without ever firing a single bullet. This is a sensitive issue for Russians, and they will try to bury this video in the algorithm. Except they would fail if you help us by clicking on the like button. Thank you. In July of 2025, an Antonov An-24 passenger plane carrying 48 people crashed in Russia's Far East as it prepared to land. That incident killed everyone on board. The tragedy shone a harsh light on a grim reality. Russia is being pushed to rely on aging Soviet-era aircraft flying far beyond their intended lifespans. A week later, Aeroflot, the nation's flag carrier, was hit by a crippling cyber attack, grounding dozens of flights and throwing airports into chaos. These incidents are not isolated. They are symptoms of a system stretched beyond its limits, a fleet growing older by the day, engineers struggling with shortages, and airlines forced to keep aircraft flying with fewer resources and greater risks. For Aeroflot's planes to stay safe, reliable, and airworthy, the airline needed constant technical support and spare parts from Airbus and Boeing. Without them, safety risks rise, durability drops, and every flight becomes a gamble in the sky. Almost overnight, Aeroflot, once a global titan, was grounded. But do not make the mistake of underestimating Russia. There was a time when it owned the skies, and the story began with the help from a weird country. The chapter of Russian aviation begins in the chaos of 1917, with the Russian Revolution tearing an empire apart. Amid the collapse of the old world, the new Bolshevik leaders looked upward and saw the future in the sky. To them, aviation wasn't just about travel. It was about power, progress, and the modernization of a country that still lived mostly on farms. With 12 time zones and endless frozen distances, airplanes became the key to uniting a divided land. By April of 1918, the Soviet government began studying how to build civilian air networks. But as civil war consumed the country, the dream stayed grounded for 2 long years. Then, in 1921, the first Soviet air routes finally took off, connecting cities like Kharkov and Moscow. Pilots flew old World War I bombers. Igor Sikorsky's mighty Ilya Muromets now converted to carry mail and a handful of passengers. These were fragile beginnings, noisy, unreliable, and underfunded. But then an unexpected help came from an unlikely ally. Unexpected because today, that same country is one of Russia's fiercest enemies. That country is Germany. And the partnership had a great start in the beginning. In November of 1921, a joint German-Russian airline was born, Luft. Using Dutch-built Fokker F-3 aircraft, it connected Königsberg to Moscow and marked the dawn of true Soviet passenger aviation. Luft grew fast, and by the 1930s, it flew hundreds of flights a year, using both German and Soviet planes, including the ANT-9, designed by young Andrei Tupolev, a name that would soon define Russian aviation. But when Nazi Germany rose to power, cooperation collapsed. On March 30th, 1937, Luft was dissolved, its wings crippled by politics. By then, another Soviet creation had already taken flight, Dobrolet, founded in 1923 as the country's first homegrown civil air company. It launched regular routes between Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod using German Junkers F-13 aircraft. Flying was no luxury. Passengers faced freezing cabins, deafening engines, and unpredictable schedules. Yet despite the hardships, Dobrolet expanded deeper into Siberia and even into Mongolia, connecting lands that had never seen an aircraft before. But as the 1920s ended, the communist state grew wary of anything that looked like private enterprise. By 1930, Dobrolet was nationalized and merged into a state-run civil air fleet. Determined to be independent from foreign designs, the Soviet Union ordered all future planes to be built domestically. Designers like Tupolev, Kalinin, and Bertini created a new generation of Soviet aircraft, sturdy, versatile, and unmistakably Russian. Tupolev's ANT-20, a 6-engine giant capable of carrying over 70 passengers, became a flying monument to Soviet engineering. And on March 26, 1932, the entire Soviet civil air fleet was officially renamed Aeroflot, the company that would soon echo across the globe. For decades, Russia's state-owned Aeroflot wasn't just an airline. It was an empire in the sky. By 2020, the Aeroflot group commanded a fleet of over 200 aircraft. It transported people, fought forest fires, mapped the land, and spread the Soviet dream to the most remote corners of the country. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 22, 2022, Russia's national flag carrier Aeroflot was a true global airline. It connected Moscow to 146 destinations across the world, including 4 major cities in the United States: Washington, D.C., New York, Los Angeles, and Miami. From Europe to Asia, from Africa to the Americas, the Russian tricolor flew proudly in skies across the globe. But then, everything changed. After the war began, the world responded with sanctions, and Russia's skies began to close. Airspaces started shutting down for any plane bearing the Russian flag. With this, Aeroflot was hit with surface-level damage. Now, why do I say surface level? If an airline is blocked from entering almost every country, then that should be the last stage of damage, right? Well, no. Almost every plane in Aeroflot's fleet wasn't truly Russian at all. They were leased from Western companies. For years, Russia's own manufacturers, Sukhoi Civil Aircrafts, Tupolev, and Yakovlev, couldn't keep pace with the giants like Airbus and Boeing. Those Western jets carried EASA and FAA certifications, giving them the freedom to fly across international borders with ease. And then came the fear, a cold, unmistakable fear that if any of those leased planes landed outside of Russia, they'd be seized, impounded, and repossessed, flown off to serve other airlines. According to the 2024 Simplifying report, Aeroflot operated 292 aircraft, a mix of Airbus and Boeing models, planes it could no longer freely service, maintain, or replace. Just a year before the invasion, in 2021, Russia had added 52 new commercial jets to its fleet, 27 Airbus, 3 Boeing, and 22 Sukhoi superjets. But even those so-called domestic Sukhois still relied on imported Western parts. That is why, once sanctions hit, the production of Russian-built planes collapsed. The country's manufacturing capacity was never large enough to begin with, but just when Russia needed the local aircrafts the most, its production lines began to fall silent. The original target for 24-25 was ambitious, 171 new aircraft, and then it was slashed to 21, and then again cut. By August of 2025, Russia had managed to deliver just 1 of the 15 commercial aircraft it had planned for the year, a brutal symbol of how hard it is to build a self-sufficient aviation industry inside an isolated economy. One industry insider put it bluntly: there is no component base, no technology, no production facilities, and no engineers. Creating all of this from scratch takes years, if not decades. Between 2021 and 2024, imports of foreign aircraft engines and components collapsed, falling from $152 million to just $43 million. What once bought entire engines now barely covers a few spare parts. Even Rostec, the powerful state conglomerate overseeing Russia's major aircraft programs, the Superjet 100, Tu-214, Il-114, and the once-celebrated MC-21, is falling behind. The MC-21, designed as Russia's answer to the Airbus A320 and Boeing 737, was meant to prove the country could stand on its own. But the results have been disappointing. Heavier than planned, shorter range, lower efficiency, and little interest from airlines. Now, serial production of the MC-21, the SG-100 and its new PD-8 engines, and the IL-114 turboprop have been officially postponed to 2026, 2 years behind schedule. Despite all the talk of import substitution, the truth is undeniable. Russia still depends heavily on foreign parts. But then it found a genius strategy, and almost no one could do anything to stop Russia for very long. It found a web of middlemen to keep its aviation sector alive. To survive, Russia turned to unlikely allies, and Iran was the first. In the summer of 2022, Moscow and Tehran reportedly signed an agreement allowing Iran to supply spare parts and provide maintenance services for Russian-operated planes. According to state outlet RBC, Iran was chosen because it was not afraid of secondary sanctions from the US or the European Union. After decades of living under Western restrictions themselves, Iran had become an expert at repairing and reverse engineering foreign-made aircraft and components, experience Russia desperately needed. But Moscow didn't stop there. By November of 2023, reports revealed that Aeroflot was launching a new partnership with Rosatom, the state nuclear energy corporation, to manufacture replicas of Airbus and Boeing parts inside Russia. Aeroflot's leadership confirmed the plan, a massive project to design, certify, and mass-produce crucial aircraft components: air and water filters, composite panels, rubber seals, metal fittings, and even electronic cabin systems like inverters, sensors, lighting, and display modules. In December of 2023, the Russian government made its most dramatic move yet, injecting 1.09 trillion rubles, nearly $12 billion, to keep its aviation industry from total collapse. And even with sanctions tightening, somehow Russian companies kept the parts coming through the back door. Customs data from 2024 revealed at least $300,000 worth of aircraft components entering Russia via Turkey, China, Kyrgyzstan, and the UAE. Small but vital covert lifelines, keeping the nation's fleet barely airborne. Among those shipments were parts from Safran, Honeywell, and Rolls-Royce, all Western manufacturers that publicly deny any violations, insisting they're taking strong measures to prevent sanctioned goods from being diverted to Russia. And yet, behind the scenes, Russian companies continued doing business where they could. In February of 2024, reports revealed that Moldovan companies had secretly brokered $15 million worth of aircraft parts for Russian airlines, slipping quietly through the cracks of international sanctions. And that was really just the tip of the iceberg. Since May of 2022, Russia has managed to import an estimated $1.2 billion worth of Airbus and Boeing parts, according to a Reuters investigation. Even more striking, in 2024 alone, Russian firms quietly spent over $12 million buying aircraft components from Ukraine's Motor Sich, despite the ongoing war and strict trade restrictions. Then came September 11th, 2025, a quiet announcement from Washington that sent shockwaves through Eastern Europe's aviation circles. The U.S. Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, granted Belavia, the Belarusian national airline, permission to purchase spare parts and new aircraft from Western suppliers. Now, to most, it sounded routine, just another license. But to Moscow, it was something else entirely, an opportunity. Through Belavia, Russian airlines could now use Belarus as a middleman, quietly bypassing sanctions to acquire the components they desperately needed to keep their grounded fleets alive. This move effectively opened a back door into Western supply chains, a loophole Moscow hoped to exploit. However, just a day later, on September 12, 2025, the U.S. Bureau of Industry and Security, the BIS, clarified the decision. Certain Belavia aircraft were simply allowed to resume international flights and receive maintenance. Restrictions were lifted on 8 Boeing jets, removing bans on repairs, modernization, and spare parts. But those planes were still forbidden to fly to Russia or assist Russian carriers. The statement made one thing clear: Washington is watching closely. Every aircraft approved for service is being monitored and tracked, leaving Russia little room to move. So, even if Belarus offers Moscow a temporary lifeline, it won't be enough to solve the long-term shortage of parts and maintenance support. Because no matter the alliances, money, or shadow deals, one truth remains: all these efforts can't stop Russia's aviation industry from falling out of the sky. Even Russia's Minister of Industry and Trade, Anton Alekhanov, has admitted the scale of the crisis, calling it a unique and hyper-complex challenge. No country in the world produces aircraft with complete domestic parts. Since sanctions began, the Kremlin has tried everything: massive subsidies, emergency loans, rushed attempts to build domestic planes, even buying back leased Boeings and Airbuses that Western companies could no longer legally maintain. In 2023, Moscow went even further, tapping 300 billion rubles, roughly $3.5 billion, from its sovereign wealth fund to transfer the leases of 169 aircraft from Western leasers to a state agency under Rosaviatsia's control. But despite all that spending, the skies haven't gotten any safer. The biggest challenge Russia faces isn't just building new planes, it's keeping its aging fleet in the air without official maintenance, certified parts, or technical support from Boeing and Airbus. According to Reuters, Russian airlines, flying a fleet of over 700 aircraft, most of them Western-built, are now forced to depend on shadowy, indirect import routes just to keep their original jets operational. When Boeing, Airbus, and Jeppesen withdrew from the Russian market in 2022, airlines lost access to vital navigation databases and digital flight charts, the backbone of modern aviation. 3.5 years into the war, pilots and engineers describe an aviation system that's literally falling apart midair. Pre-flight calculations that were once handled by sophisticated onboard systems are now being done by hand. Weather checks rely on public websites, and GPS interference has grown so severe that crews are sometimes ordered to fly with their collision avoidance systems switched off. Pilots were forced to return to the old ways, flying with paper binders packed full of charts for every route, every airport, every country. What once fit on a sleek tablet now fills a suitcase in the cockpit. It took nearly a year for Russian tech firms to develop their own flight software. Crude, buggy, and unstable at first, but barely functional enough to keep planes flying. Even today, it lags far behind international standards, leaving Russian crews to operate with outdated data and unreliable systems. And the risks? They've never been higher. With GPS signals jammed or spoofed around Moscow and other major cities, pilots are disabling safety systems to stop the alarms from going off. The very systems designed to prevent mid-air collisions or ground impacts. One engineer said, if the military can't tell a civilian plane from a threat, it treats it like one. And the danger is already showing. For a time, the only foreign country Russian jets could reach was Belarus, with just 3 daily flights between Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport and Minsk. Slowly, Aeroflot began to rebuild what little international network it could, flying to nations that refused to impose sanctions. The former Soviet republics and allies across the Caucasus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. Then came others: Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, China, Cuba, Egypt, India, Iran, Thailand, Turkey, the UAE, and Vietnam. During the winter, Aeroflot added Maldives, Mauritius, and the Seychelles, Russia's remaining windows to the outside world. Experts warn that these emergency measures might keep the planes in the air, but they don't guarantee trained pilots, qualified crews, or well-serviced aircraft. Because of losses, airlines slashed pilot schedules, let go of their most expensive and experienced aviators, and cut training on Western-built jets, aircraft that still make up more than 2/3 of Russia's civilian fleet. And yes, Aeroflot's passenger traffic rose by 21% in the first half of 2024, reaching 25.4 million passengers, according to Kommersant. Also, Aeroflot brags about a 76% rise in net profit, claiming 74 billion rubles earned. But reality is collapsing beneath the surface. By August of 2025, only 1 out of 15 promised commercial aircraft had been delivered. Also, the growth hides a dangerous shortage of pilots, of crews, and of planes fit to fly. Russia's aviation regulator, Rosaviatsia, officially limited pilots to 90 hours flying per month, a rule meant to ensure safety. But even with those caps in place, there are still not enough qualified crews to meet the growing demand. Over 350 flights sat stranded on the tarmac at Moscow's International Airport just 2 days in June of 2025. Why? Because Russia's state-owned flagship carrier, Aeroflot, had simply run out of cabin crews. The story first broke on Aviatorshina, a popular telegram forum for Russian airline insiders. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Just a month later, in late July, 60 more Aeroflot flights were canceled out of Sheremetyevo, again due to a shortage of pilots, according to the same source. Dozens more were delayed or rescheduled. An investigation by RFE/RL's Russian service revealed a deeper truth. Under the weight of sanctions, soaring costs, and collapsing revenues, Aeroflot can no longer reliably find the planes, the pilots, or even the crews it needs to keep its vast network running. And the planes that are still flying, many are being kept alive on borrowed time, patched together with salvaged parts, uncertified repairs, and sheer desperation. The question now isn't if the system will fail, it's how long it can keep flying before it does. In July of 2024, it breathed a sigh of relief when Aeroflot made headlines, announcing its first profit since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. 42.2 billion rubles, about $470 million in profit for the second quarter of 2024. But even Aeroflot admitted the profit came not from stability, but from surging demand and soaring costs. According to Kommersant, Aeroflot's expenses for fuel, maintenance, repairs, and spare parts have more than tripled since mid-2023, now reaching nearly 33 billion rubles, or $367 million. And fuel, the lifeblood of aviation, is draining budgets faster than ever. The St. Petersburg International Mercantile Exchange reports that jet fuel prices in Russia have jumped 30% since March of 2022. The government has already loosened production rules to stabilize the market, letting refineries mix summer diesel with kerosene to create winter-grade fuel. But according to Maxim Dyachenko, a managing partner at fuel giant Prolium, this quick fix could backfire, pushing jet fuel prices higher and adding even more pressure to Russia's already struggling aviation sector. Officials know what's coming. At a late October 2025 meeting led by Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak, the government reportedly discussed temporary price caps to stop jet fuel costs from spiraling out of control. Right now, wholesale jet fuel prices sit at 79,650 rubles per ton. It's around $988, slightly below earlier years' levels, but that's after an 11% surge since September of 2025. And the problem runs deeper. According to OilX, Ukrainian drone strikes have damaged at least 30 Russian refineries, slashing processing volumes by 10%, down to 4.86 million barrels per day. Even as Aeroflot fills its planes again, experts warn that the math simply doesn't work. Flights to friendly nations, China, India, Turkey, can't replace the lucrative long-haul routes to Europe and the United States, lost after February of 2022. Before the war, flyover fees, payments from foreign airlines crossing Russian airspace, brought in up to $800 million a year, nearly a third of Aeroflot's pre-tax profits. Those earnings are now gone. Ticket prices have climbed more than 25% since 2023, averaging around $77 per 1,000 kilometers. But even that can't close the financial gap left by sanctions, lost routes, and rising costs. And now the government's grand plan to rebuild its domestic aircraft industry, already falling behind schedule, may be scaled back. In early August of 2025, Kommersant reported that Moscow could reconsider its production targets. And in late July, Transportation Minister Vitaly Savalyev confirmed through RIA Novosti that the government had no plans to buy back more leased Western aircraft. So while Aeroflot may post short-term profits on paper, the truth behind the numbers tells another story. A company flying higher for now, but spending more than ever just to stay airborne. And it's happening not only to Aeroflot or Russia's major carriers, even the smallest regional airlines are feeling the strain. In fact, cargo airlines are under even greater pressure, pushed to the edge of collapse. Russian cargo carriers have now warned that they may cease operations entirely within 3 to 5 years, according to a report from Kommersant. The warning came during a roundtable discussion at the Russian Civic Chamber, and the data behind it shows why the situation is so dire. Before the war, Russia's air freight industry was growing steadily. Between 2015 and 2021, volumes increased from 5.6 to 9.2 billion ton kilometers, peaking just before the invasion. But once sanctions hit, the market crashed. By 2022, freight turnover fell to $2.8 billion. In 2023, it plunged to $1.7 billion. In 2024, it barely recovered to $1.9 billion. And in the first 10 months of 2025, only 1.25 billion ton kilometers were recorded. With almost no access to Western aircraft or parts, carriers are stuck with aging Soviet-era cargo planes that are running out of service life. To survive, companies are asking the government to extend the lifespan of IL-76TD airframes from 40 to 45 years, and to stretch D-30KP2 engine limits from 14 to 16,000 hours. But according to Aviacon Zitotrans CEO Alexander Osikov, the market for engines with enough remaining service life is almost empty, and buying new ones costs more than 400 million rubles each. Far too expensive, when the airframes themselves will need to be retired within a few years. Without extensions, parts of the fleet will be permanently grounded by 2028. Financially, the situation is just as bleak. Expert Konstantin Yaroshenko estimates that cargo aviation needs around 10 billion rubles in subsidies every year to stay afloat. Instead, cargo carriers received only 2.9 billion rubles in 2022, while passenger airlines, the government's priority, received over 100 billion. The situation has become so desperate that Moscow has begun using Kazakh and Uzbek airlines to operate domestic Russian routes, a clear sign of just how difficult it has become to keep Russia's aviation industry airborne. In fact, during the 2024 BRICS summit, Russia went even further. According to the Economic Times, Moscow requested India, China, and several Central Asian nations to allow their airlines to fly within Russian territory. This was part of a proposal known as cabotage, the right of an airline from one country to carry passengers or cargo between 2 points inside of another country's borders. It's a privilege most nations guard closely to protect their domestic carriers. Only a few regions, like the European Union, permit it freely among member states. For context, a foreign airline can't fly passengers from New York to Washington, D.C., then continue to another U.S. city. That's cabotage, and it's strictly restricted. Russia's proposal to let foreign airlines fly domestic routes inside its borders was unprecedented, and it showed just how severe the crisis had become. But India quickly rejected the plan. Indian Airlines explained to their government that they were already facing a shortage of planes within India itself, a shortage so severe it was limiting their own expansion. Most of the fleet of Indian carriers is leased, and leasers will not give permission for their planes to go to Russia. Along with that, we risk losing insurance coverage, said a senior airline executive to the Economic Times. He added, "There's a tremendous aircraft shortage, and we're struggling to meet our own growth targets. In such a situation, it's unlikely any Indian carrier would take on projects like this." With India, China, and other BRICS partners hesitant or outright unwilling, Moscow's hopes for help from abroad are fading pretty fast. Even friendly nations don't want to risk their fleets, their finances, or their international standing, leaving Russia's skies more isolated than ever. However, by July of 2025, Russia finally managed a small but symbolic breakthrough. After months of negotiations, Moscow and Tashkent reached an agreement to triple the number of direct flights between Russia and Uzbekistan, expanding the total to over 1,000 flights per week. Under the new arrangement, the Tashkent-Moscow route alone would see 50 flights per week from each side, totaling 100 flights weekly. The Samarkand-Moscow corridor would rise to 46 flights, with 23 from each country. Other key routes, Bukhara-Moscow, Urgench-Moscow, Fergana-Moscow, Namangan-Moscow, would each operate 14 flights per side, adding up to 112 flights in total. In addition, Tashkent-St. Petersburg, Tashkent-Krasnoyarsk, and Tashkent-Sochi routes would each run 14 weekly flights from both countries, amounting to another 42 flights combined. The Termez-Moscow route would host 10 flights per side, bringing the total to 20 a week. Beyond specific city pairs, the deal opens the skies even wider. Russian airlines can now operate 560 flights from 80 Russian international airports to all international airports in Uzbekistan. Uzbek carriers will run 203 flights from Uzbek airports to 29 of Russia's largest international airports. Crucially, the agreement removes previous restrictions on the number of airlines permitted to operate triangle flights, routes linking 3 cities, and gives each airline the freedom to choose up to 5 destinations under this model. While the deal is presented as a gesture of regional cooperation, for Moscow it's more that it's a lifeline. By deepening ties with Uzbekistan, Russia is not only trying to expand flight options for stranded passengers, but also quietly more aviation parts, technical expertise, and maintenance access through a friendly neighbor. Another subtle effort to circumvent Western isolation and keep its crippled aviation network alive. But this lifeline could come at a cost. If the US and the EU decide to impose sanctions on Uzbekistan Airways for cooperating with Russian carriers or sharing restricted airspace, Tashkent could soon find itself under pressure, and Russia once again facing the risk of losing one of its few remaining aviation partners. Still, for now, Moscow has breathing room and time to think about how to keep its skies open. Because in a country as vast as Russia, aviation isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Trains can't cover the distances, not when war stretches resources thin and cargo demands keep growing. In the end, Russia's aviation industry may continue to fly, but only with multiple conditions applied. Whether it survives until the war's end, or finally collapses under the weight of isolation and decay, only time will tell.